Astonishing Chicago, a city where they are always rubbing the lamp and fetching up the genie and contriving and achieving new impossibilities. Mark Twain.
During the late 1800s, America's economy was in a bad state. The Gilded Age was a time of social, cultural, and economic change. In 1871, the Chicago Fire destroyed 3.3 square miles, burning 17,500 buildings to the ground, and leaving Chicago and its economy in shambles. Chicago also became the city for new immigration and labor. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 brought some negative attention to the city. During this Gilded Age, the U.S. began vying to host the World's Fair in the early 1880s in order to promote commercial success of the recovering nation. The two largest financially backed cities of the U.S. became Chicago and New York. New York was financed by J.P. Morgan, Vanderbilt, and William Astor, while Chicago was financed by Marshall Field, Armour, Swift, and McCormick. Chicago eventually won out, partially due to the promise of Tesla's coil, a new electricity system, creating a cheaper and more efficient light source.
The city, you know where that phrase comes from? That came from the efforts to promote the fair, because it was a competition between Chicago and New York, and all the New York people got annoyed with the Chicago folks and basically said they're full wind. So Chicago acquired its moniker, the Windy City, not from Lake Michigan, but from the competition over the fair.
Many cultures, ideas, and attractions were introduced at this fair. In the summer of 1893, 1 out of every 4 Americans visited the city for these reasons.
There was a young history professor at Princeton University whose name was Woodrow Wilson, future president of the United States. His wife had never traveled west of the Allegheny Mountains, and she had artistic inclination. She had been to art school before they were married in New York and so forth. She was a well-educated woman. This was just coming to Chicago was just a great revelation to her. She remembered it and talked about it for the rest of her life.
The Chicago World's Fair helped revive the city and allowed the culture to burgeon in the midst of an economic struggle. The fair helped spring Chicago up from the Gilded Age and pushed it into the Progressive Era. The construction of the buildings and structures of Chicago served as an integral part of the success of the fair. Since the Chicago Fire destroyed much of the city's important buildings, one of the main points of the fair was to literally reconstruct the city from the ground up. 200 buildings were erected to host all the planned events, a few of which remained long after the exposition to serve everyday purposes in the city. Steel frame construction was still a fairly new strategy at the time, but the city wanted to experiment and to replace what was lost in the Chicago Fire, calling upon rising architect Daniel H. Burnham to do the job. His work can still be seen at the Union Stockyard Gate and the Marshall Field Company building. Another significant characteristic of the fair was the alabaster appearance. The purpose was to create a pure utopian-esque image of Chicago, a neoclassical work of architectural art. Since marble was too expensive to be used in such abundance, most temporary buildings at the exposition were not made out of stone, but either white stucco or a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber, which was then painted white to appear to be gleaming. These buildings disintegrated shortly after the fair closed. The addition of street lamps added to the bright image of the city, as well as making the streets navigable at night. The city went so far to preserve its untainted image that the usage of coal was banned during the exposition. All this effort led to Chicago being dubbed the White City.
Another thing is that Chicago was seen as a beautiful place. Now, some of that is not correct. Chicago was not all that beautiful, but the World's Fair made Chicago look beautiful. And then people who came to Chicago from out of town and people who lived in Chicago talked about making Chicago a more beautiful place, and a movement began called the City Beautiful Movement, which you may be familiar with. And the architect and superintendent of the World's Fair, Daniel H. Burnham, a Chicagoan, became associated with the City Beautiful movement.
There's a distinctive kind of aesthetic that comes out of the fair. This is what culture, this is what civilization, this is what the United States looks like, reconstructed after the Civil War. So this official architecture is monumental. It has echoes of the Renaissance, the kind of neoclassicism filtered through the Renaissance, signifying that the United States has become a civilized place, as civilized as Europe.
The superior architecture of the fair also served as an attraction. The Ferris wheel, which was engineered by George W.B. Ferris, built it especially to be a main attraction for the fair. This massive wheel, able to load over 2,000 passengers, was built to be as great as the Eiffel Tower in the Paris Exposition of 1889, attracting visitors with its dazzling lights. A band was situated in one of the cars to provide entertainment, and couples even wanted to get married in its highest car. Other attractions and exhibitions at the fair, such as the Midway Plaisance, helped culture in America flourish. Designed by Frederick Putnam, this was the main attraction for all cultural affairs. This was where the primitive human exhibits were, where audiences could go and walk around and experience the, quote, measures of which humanity has progressed.
You get closer to the main exposition grounds, and race becomes ethnicity. So it's a really interesting study in the power of amusement to reinforce racial stereotypes. The reason it's so important is what happens at the fair is that these racial stereotypes get articulated under the umbrella of anthropology, which is to say you have professional, highly educated social scientists lending their authority to these kinds of portrayals.
Another popular attraction, which was not actually at the fair, was Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
He never called it a show because he thought it was an authentic representation of the American West. It was always Buffalo Bill's Wild West. But to be part of the fair promoters, the fair organizers are going to charge a huge rental fee. And Buffalo Bill, being wealthy enough and savvy enough, said, forget you. So what he does is he basically leases a square of land. So if you can imagine, here's my map of the fair. So here's the White City. Lake Michigan's over here. Here's the White City. Here's the Midway running in a mile. Okay, where it still is. There's the Midway Plaisance. And then you've got the rest of Jackson Park here. So this corner right here, the Buffalo Bill sets up his show. And according to Buffalo Bill's promoters, more people saw his show that summer than went to Chicago World's Fair.
Edward Muybridge also used the Zoopraxilographical Hall to give lectures on exotic animals to the public. In retrospect, this hall was the first movie theater playing short films of animal and human movements using the freeze-frame style.
In addition to visual entertainment, the fair exposed many different types of music to the public. Indonesian music had its first performance in the United States during the fair, and a group of hula dancers brought awareness of Hawaii and its music to the U.S. The fair was also a segue for black musicians, breaking racial barriers and introducing black strains of music into the white mainstream.
More popular music on the main fairgrounds actually came from bands, and especially John Philip Sousa. So Sousa actually markets himself and band music, outdoor band music, through the fair, so that becomes immensely popular. And it displaces classical music as the music of something called civilization, the music of the White City.
Soon-to-be famous musicians also made their debut, like Scott Joplin, a young player who brought early forms of ragtime to the fair.
The fair also opened America up to another form of culture, food. Part of the food displays, the H.J. Heinz Company used its superior marketing techniques to attract customers. Heinz promised a free gift to visitors of his second-floor booth, where they were able to taste samples of the company's many varieties. The free gift was a popular souvenir, the pickle pin, a pickle-shaped charm with the Heinz name stamped on it. The Heinz booth became a popular attraction amongst fairgoers. After this, the Heinz Company stayed in Chicago and is now a staple American food company. Several new foods that originated from all over the U.S. made its way into the public eye at the fair, including hamburgers, french fries, and carbonated drinks. The hot dog was also popularized at the fair. Two Austrian immigrants, Emil Reichel and Sam Ladany, came to sell sausage and were so successful that their company, Vienna Beef, came to stay in Chicago. Now, Vienna Beef is used as the Chicago-style hot dog. Another popular American food, Cracker Jacks, also gained its fame at the fair. Originally called simply candied popcorn and peanuts, it underwent a perfecting process to get the kernels separate from the rest of the mix. Then it got its name when someone at the fair remarked, "That's Cracker Jack." Countless other American food companies were popularized here, amongst those being Hershey's and Anheuser-Busch. Milton S. Hershey, a failed candy maker, was inspired by the art of chocolate at the fair and then purchased German machinery to start his own chocolate company, now Hershey's. The famous American brewing company, Anheuser-Busch, was recognized as the world's highest quality beer at the fair, and here it gained popularity on a national and even international level.
With the birth of so many great American companies, the Columbian Exposition served as a catalyst for the consumerism that sprang up in the 1920s. But before these new companies were around, they started with inventors, people who would revolutionize the global market through their innovative inventions and would root themselves in Chicago, creating jobs and forcing Chicago to continue its growth.
For instance, Nikolaus Otto displayed his combustion engine that would inspire Henry Ford to work with automobiles. Also, electrical innovations such as floodlights and refrigerators were becoming more and more popular thanks to Tesla's coil.
Within 10 years, one downtown after another across the United States wanted to light that downtown up with light bulbs. And some of the earliest night baseball games and football games were played in the late 1890s. You know, they would string bulbs up in a park or a stadium or on a field.
What the fair generates are new ideas for refrigeration. They have this massive ice storage plant. The idea that you can actually cool food and preserve food in vast quantities for sale at a later date is a pretty interesting, I would say, cool invention.
Braille, which revolutionized education for the blind, including Helen Keller, was brought to the fair. Here, Helen Keller and her mother met her future Braille teacher, Frank Havenhall, who had invented the Braille writer. An early form of the zipper, called the clasp locker, was first seen at the fair at a tent set up by Whitcomb Judson, where he sewed it on his boots and clothes to display how it worked.
The postcard. The modern postcard is embedded towards Chicago World's Fair. I wish you were here. Facebook has its origins there.
With all these new inventions and ideas, and constant flyers and tents used for advertising, people wanted to purchase some of the things they saw. And even though the current economic condition of the United States didn't allow for such excessive spending, the very mention of updated technology whetted the thirst of consumers. And these innovations, such as the automobile and the refrigerator, would later explode in the market. Although the economic rush and the jobs that were created when the World's Fair came to Chicago were temporary like the decomposing buildings, the reputation of Chicago and the images and events that people experienced at the fair were permanently embedded in the minds of the people from across the world. New ideologies were also introduced, such as the American frontier officially coming to a close.
You may have heard of a historian. His name was Frederick Jackson Turner, and he taught history at the University of Wisconsin, and he went to a meeting of historians held at the Art Institute in Chicago in 1893, reached into his briefcase, brought out a paper, and he read it. And the title of the paper was The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And what he said in that paper is that the frontier shaped the American character more than anything else. And now what we have to do is think about what it means now that, according to the 1890 census, the frontier period in American history is closed. And what made that question so visible was the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. So if you look at that Chicago World's Fair, there is no doubt that the frontier is closed. You've got the White City. As you walk along the Midway, what do you see? Frontier for possibilities elsewhere in the world. And there you have the beginning of something called the American century, America's 20th century. So there's a lot going on.
Other legacies such as the entertainment and amusement have outlasted the fair to be inspiration of entertainers to come, from the famous cartoons of Walt Disney to the music of the Roaring Twenties. After the World's Fair, Chicago became a more modern city.
A more modern city, and a city that others knew about on a national and international scale.
The legacies of the 1893 World's Fair left Chicago as the city to be in, and for a moment it was not recognized as the second city.
and the rest is, shall we say, history.